if everything I dreamt of it was true? I take your blessings with your heartaches too. It's so easy and so wonderful to know it's you.
It's no secret that scarcity and abundance of commodities can drive markets, especially the ones involved in creative ventures like comic books, for example, where in the middle of a long running continuity, when one storyline gets stale, they move into a period of trying out new ideas, which are less likely to work but are an important step to freshen things up. The proverbial testing the waters moment always brings about really interesting mutations that in other periods would have seemed, if not outright bad, just an exercise in indulgence. Of course, when we are talking about comic books, and I am referring specifically to the ones published by the two juggernauts within the industry, Marvel and DC Comics, there's a whole lot that can be said about their attempt to revitalize themselves in the eyes of an audience that has always been a fickle bunch. While every year comic book readers seem to be growing at a steady rate, a very low percentage of those comics being read account for the superhero comics, which is their primary content. And this is a little strange when you consider how both these companies seem to be enjoying a period of unparalleled success and fame under the spotlight because of their superhero characters. But we all know that's largely down to their respective film franchises. Now, I grew up on these comics. I spent most of my early childhood collecting any Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man comics I could get my hands on. And being a kid from India, usually the comics I would acquire from the newspaper stands outside train stations and bookstores would be reruns of comics that had come out in the States, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So naturally I was never up to date with the latest and hottest new comics hitting the shelves. But it didn't matter to me because like millions of kids around the world, I was hooked to the pages of these superhero comics. And more importantly, they acted like a gateway into the medium of comic books in general. I think we all have experiences like that. When we are kids, we fall in love with something, and then when you get older, your tastes start to change. Maybe you experience new things. Maybe time takes its toll, and suddenly you're not the person you were when you were 10 years old. And what do you do then? Just move on? Around the late 20th century, a similar conversation opened up among comic book sellers. For many years, comic books had been catered for a younger audience. Because when these American superhero comics hit the shelves, these kids were the entirety of their audience. The whole medium was considered juvenile, and its creators had to work within these predefined boundaries of writing for a specific age group. But as the years rolled by, these kids who were once interested in these comics like they were interested in toys and action figures slowly started growing up. So comic sellers and creators had to evolve with their growing fan base, or they would risk losing their older fans. In came a retinue of writers to spice things up for a while. And from time to time, there were other bolder decisions taken with certain characters to keep things rolling. But overall, this was a perennial problem for the American comic industry. Not just because coming up with fresh ideas or innovative new directions is hard, but because making money in the comic making business is. This has famously been the case since time immemorial. Comic book companies have always operated under the weight of financial instability. Writers and artists were often underpaid because companies couldn't afford to, not with their own lives hanging from a thread. Marvel even went bankrupt in the 90s. The situation isn't any better today. We're in the middle of a global pandemic that has swept through businesses worldwide, affecting them forever, and comic books are no exemption from this. The trouble with being a creator in such trying times meant that often there was very little room for creative liberty. The stories needed to be curated and planned months in advance so that everything could be laid out. It was a business model that needed to assure revenue streams would not be affected at all. And all of that brings us to 1993, to the birth of DC's Vertigo imprint. It happened over a period stretching the early 90s. The whole idea behind coming up with this new imprint was to address the need for diversification within the mainline stories. The adult independent comics could be printed under the Vertigo label, while DC's main continuity could go on hassle-free. Vertigo paved the way for more mature audiences of DC to enjoy comic books that were meant for them. Karen Berger, the then DC Comics editor and the woman in charge of Vertigo, also started seeking out new writers, new talent, people who had shown great promise in the art of storytelling, assembling these young writers under the banner of Vertigo. Of course, many of these writers who were given their first opportunity by Berger are well known within the industry today, and many of them were not only from the US, but were also imports from Britain. Britain was churning out some great writers in this period, both in comic books and in novels, and Berger knew that and scouted out the best of them. What Vertigo brought to the party, the likes of Preacher, the saga of the Swamp Thing by Alan Moore, Bill Willingham's Fables, Grant Morrison's Sebastian O, iZombie, American Vampire, Hellblazer, and of course, the crowning jewel, Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics. These stories brought much needed diversity to the superhero and fantasy side of DC, while simultaneously handing back power to the creators to bring their own magic to the table. These were creator-owned stories with imaginative ideas, and most importantly, they were simply good stories. And good stories tend to garner attention and good faith from their audience. I mean, DC weren't the only ones to try this. Marvel had their own imprint, Epic Comics, for their mature audiences. And independent comic publishers like Dark Horse Comics are always trying to offer opportunity to new talent. And if the last year has taught us anything, being stuck in lockdown for months and months on end, it's that we've grown more and more reliant on the amount of stories that's available to us these days. From Netflix to Disney Plus to video games on Steam to comic books and novels. I mean, these were our only ways to explore the world in a period where the world became unavailable to us. And the more diversity we had in these stories, both thematically and in ideas, the more people could enjoy them. I have to admit, I only recently became aware of Vertigo. My first contact was maybe a couple or so years ago, through Telltale Games' adapted episodic game, The Wolf Among Us, based on Willingham's Fable series. Funnily enough, there are a lot of parallels between the history of comic books and video games. Both started off exclusively for kids, and now years down the line, with all these kids grown up, we have video games with stories with as much depth as any great movie you might get to watch. I've often wondered about the state of comic books in general. Any industry that flails under financial instability for as long as comic books have done often finds itself looking at the idea of creative liberty as one tinged with risk, the kind of risk that could lose you a lot of money, put you under the cosh overnight. And it shouldn't be like that. In such circumstances, it's always difficult to realize the true potential of comic books on a consistent basis. But it's always there to see. There are so many great independent graphic novels out there, and so many great superhero stories amongst the long-running continuity. So many of them brimming with life and visual splendor, just waiting to be discovered, waiting to be set free if things were run a little bit better maybe. And in those brief moments we get to see a truly original work, everyone recognizes it. And in a medium where creators often feel like their hands are tied, it's always great to get to see a work where the shackles can finally fall off. So I know it's been a long time since my last video. I've been busy recently with exams and assignments. They've been piling up for the last few months, and even a global pandemic can't keep those at bay, unfortunately. But it's great to finally get back to making these videos. I've got a bunch of stuff planned for the next few months, so if you're enjoying the content I'm putting out, make sure to like them. And subscribe to the channel if you want to stay tuned for more stuff like this. It helps me and the channel grow massively. Also, if you're interested, all the links to my socials are in the description below, so feel free to check those out as well. If you want to keep watching, here's a video about the graphic novel by Jeff Loeb on Batman The Long Halloween, and another one about the movie Arrival and its depiction of time through the mind of Ted Chiang.